about Palestinians. Palestinians are fine, they should have civil rights, human rights. It's about the strategic consequences of failure. And if you could have at that time resulted in something that would have created a normalization track between Israel and some 4 dozen or 5 dozen other Arab and Muslim nations around the world, many of which and most of which would have come along, but many of them were Sunni states that would have had shared the same concerns about Iran's rise and Iran's course. You may have been able to root in the Middle East a contraption, sort of like the ASEAN Regional Forum has performed in Asia, where you've had states that hate each other culturally, historically, and because of other wars, begin to talk to each other about their common security problems. That's what we need in the Middle East, but it's been impossible to do that. So that shows you what the consequences of failure are and what the side is. And my criticism of Obama and his team, who are great friends of mine, many of them, is an inability to get strategic clarity in place to sort of look at why something in particular has to prevail over other things. And I'm happy to discuss where Libya falls in this, where Syria falls in this. But today we have something where, I would also argue that the president right now is trying to manage a change with Iran without talking to the country about it. It's a huge strategic shift. And if you were to get a strategic shift with Iran and potentially get down that track, you have to figure out what is your language and narrative so that it doesn't look like you're selling out Israel or the Gulf countries or Saudi Arabia. And right now that narrative is being shaped by the street, not by world leaders. World leaders are playing a zero-sum game in this, and it's a very dangerous thing. So the US president, in my view, has not been articulate or bold enough to sort of give us that new vision, because very few of us have that real vision of what it has. We look at the Iran, as a silo. And if he fails on the Iran side, then it locks us into a different kind of track that could be equally dark, in which the United States is not perceived to be the power that most shapes the international system, and is looked at as receding. And there was an interesting report by a PLA analyst in China after the president, a couple of years into his term, I was harassing the White House for not issuing what's called its national security strategy, which it's supposed to do after its first year. I think it took about 2.5 years to get it out. But after it was read, where it basically talked about the health of the US economy being the core of US power and getting that back in place, China perceived that, and they wrote lots of reports on America is in strategic contraction. Well, Saudi Arabia today looks at us as in strategic contraction. Bibi Netanyahu in Israel looks at us as being in strategic contraction. So they are behaving in ways that are different. And so when you see things like the air defense identification zone that China just imposed, or the fact that Japan and South Korea are not talking to one another except in some levels, but not leader to leader. When you look at these issues, all of these countries are behaving a bit differently than they used to, when America used to be much more perceived to be in the saddle on many of the regional problems and the more dependable guarantor of security. In Africa, we can talk about that if you like. Latin America, we have real problems down in Brazil. We have a lot of credibility problems. Africa is sort of the taken for granted continent, Latin America is the taken for granted continent, and Africa is the taken for granted continent. Although it was interesting when George Bush was with President Obama the last couple of days in South Africa, he came back, and President Bush got off in Senegal to give a speech. I don't know what on, but I was fascinated that George W. Bush was in Africa giving a speech. That deserves attention. It's important to show when you have leaders, former U.S. leaders of that stature, speaking, whether it's in Latin America or whatever. We don't have the media machine here giving that echo, which I think would be very useful and important, not only to affirm these continents that are often neglected, but also to teach Americans that these other parts of the world matter. India, Pakistan, we can go on. Turkey, there's a lot going on in the world. And that's the point of this, is that fundamentally you need to step back and figure out how you prioritize among all of these strings that are pulling you at the same time, and figure out when you leave office, what should Obama have done? Is it all Libya? Was Libya the big thing to define his administration? I would argue that's not what he wants. I think he wants to have something that shows that he was able, like Richard Nixon did at a time of doubt about the United States, to try to reinvent confidence and reinvent trust that the United States has the ability to shape the system and to move it in better directions than it has been. That's why the stakes involved in this are so high. You know, when I talk to the White House, and I had talk about being a groupie with Joe Biden, it is interesting that people like Obama, but Obama's new to foreign policy. Remember, he's doing okay. He's going to be forced into foreign policy because domestically it's going to be crappy for him for the next few years. It's going to be really crappy for him in 2014. So he's going to spend as much time out of Washington as possible. And he's got great advisors around him, but he doesn't have yet, in my mind, a brilliant kind of Kissingerian, Nixonian, Brent Scowcroft strategic sense. We were just talking about James Baker, some other incredible, whether you liked them or didn't, but they really saw the world as a chessboard. And you said, now maybe Obama has it, but I know him. I haven't seen that in profound ways yet. He's a kind of a sloppy realist or a sloppy liberal interventionist. I can't tell which. He's somewhere in the middle, which means he's muddled. But when you look at someone like John Kerry, a lot of people are not big fans of Chuck Hagel. I am. You look at Joe Biden, and you talk to these people privately, and you watch them, as I have for years and years, in their Senate Foreign Relations Committee role or their Armed Services Committee role. These are people who have deep knowledge, personal knowledge, not only of the nuts and bolts of the international system, but they have a great sense of strategy. And I saw this in Biden there, and one of the areas in which we agreed was that power is a function of future expectations. Power is like the stock market. I'm sure many of you invest. Hope you have done better than I have. But you know, when you look at investing in a stock, you're supposed to look at where's that company going to be in a year or 2 years? What's its growth level? How do you look at it down the road? If it's flat, if it's just prospects are diminishing, that stock's going to take a huge hit. It's not going to stay in some sort of equilibrium there. It's going to take a very, very nasty hit and fall because trust has collapsed in it. And because it's not looked at that the defining edge of global affairs or that corporation's affairs aren't justifying its real-term value. And I think that's been the challenge for the United States and China. And the United States, I think, is slowly getting better, but I'm not sure if it's by accident or by design, where if you compared the United States and China looked like an internet startup stock. It looked like the Google of countries. It looked like it had no limits. All of a sudden, that's slowing down a bit, and that's taking a little bit of shine off of China, which is good. But the United States, after the financial crisis, looked like the General Motors of countries. And I say this in a friendly way because General Motors today, and General Motors, when I was saying this, are very different critters. General Motors was once a very well-branded, globally sprawling company that underperformed. And President Obama just yesterday sold all the final shares in General Motors, congratulated the return and revival of the auto industry. If any of you have rented a Chrysler or GM, it's phenomenally different today. So they've rewired themselves. They've slimmed down. They've gotten more profitable. They've gotten better. And to some degree, that's what the United States really needs to look at doing. That's how it recaptures the mystique, is can it rewire itself in strategic ways and kind of impose clarity on all this chaos, and particularly in the foreign policy and the international economic policy realm. And that, to me, seems to be the vital role of the President of the United States. And I see people like Hagel, I see people like Biden and Kerry able to do it. I see people like John McCain, who's a friend of mine. I travel with him. I have to tell you one John McCain joke. We'll open up here. What John McCain often goes, have any of you met John McCain? You probably heard this because he tells it all the time. He says, he was in an airport in Phoenix, and some guy comes up to him and says, God, you look a lot like John McCain. And John McCain says, I guess I do. And the guy says, doesn't it make you mad as hell? and John McCain's saying that joke. But anyway, but John McCain, even though I disagree with him about Iran, disagree with him about many issues, he also is a formidable thinker about strategy. And so we're not devoid of this. The debate largely is a good one. But I think the stakes matter, and I want to commend all of you for being engaged in these issues, because I have to tell you there's a lot of ignorance in the United States about how big these stakes are. I go to as many World Affairs Councils as I can to try to, I'm going to stop. Okay, but there's a lot of ignorance. People are easily hijacked by passions, and they don't understand because we don't have leaders that come in and talk to them about the fact that America is, in the eyes of much of the world, a very diminished nation compared to what it used to be. And while China would actually like us to stay strong, it's worried about Japan. Eventually they look at us as the cork in the bottle in Iran, but China also looks at us as weak. So they're testing us, seeing what the lines are. And you have South Korea and Japan, both with very good bilateral relationships with the United States, but not willing to deal with one another. This is the kind of stuff that Joe Biden just went over to deal with these leaders and try to tell them, you guys are being reckless with your own futures. Forget us. You're undermining everything that you created in terms of generating the economic magic and prosperity you have, and you're playing with fire. And so the notion that the U.S. will be able to protect Japan over these rocks, the senkakus or diutais, depending on which translation line you're on, or deal with many of the rising things, is something not there. So we have to find a different way to do that. I'm happy to discuss some of those issues. But again, strategic clarity in an age of chaos is very, very tough to do. And in 2014, I don't think there'll be a magic wand where all of this gets solved. I think you're going to continue to see an administration that's racing as fast as it can to try to, in a midterm election year, try to demonstrate that it's not giving away the House to Iran and not, undermining Saudi Arabia's interests or basically giving the Taliban all of Afghanistan, as opposed to something that looks at what are the biggest equities that it needs to preserve. I think the president is going to try and do that, but is going to be constantly pulled down in the weeds. But 2015, watch out. When there are no more elections and Obama's on his way out, the last 2 years will be really cool. So invite me back in 2015. Next year's a mess. Okay? Thank you. So, yes, sir.
I wonder if you would comment on our military capability and our priorities within the Defense Department as well as the government generally as compared to the world situation.
Well, the military is a big, big thing, and it's swelled up enormously, as did our intelligence apparatus, which is often neglected in part of the military side, but intelligence, DoD, Homeland Security, all of the kind of war fighting, war protecting, homeland protecting accounts swelled up enormously after 9/11 and continued until about 2 years ago. And those budgets are now coming down. And it's interesting to see a couple of things happen in America. One is the consensus that across Labor Day parties in the United States not go to war in Syria. That is a clear market signal that the enthusiasm for those kinds of defense budgets has fallen. And when you see significant parts of the Republican Party advocating for a continuation of the raw sequester, not the modified sequester that Paul Ryan and Patty Murray just negotiated, but the raw, blunt, crude sequester, shows that the level of support for the kind of defense spending we have there. Now, what's being brought down? In my view, shutting down these wars is a smart thing to do for the perception of U.S. power. But you've got a lot of weapon systems built in, and the biggest thing that is part of the defense budget that nobody wants to talk about because it's politically incorrect is that the soldiers that we've put through the system, many of whom, a good number of whom, are going to have ongoing benefits for the rest of their lives. Many of them have been traumatized. You have PTSD at levels we've never seen since Vietnam. You have a lot of ongoing load that is going to continue, that has nothing to do with fighting future wars. So the part of the non-fighting war capacity element of the defense budget has sworn up. So as they bring the budget down, what Chuck Hagel and his generals and General Dempsey are fighting with is how do they keep America safe while carrying the load for everything in the past? And I think it's going to be tough. Now, they just got a break because those, to a certain degree, the $45 billion cut that the DoD was going to be facing next year has now been reduced significantly. But they had a big drawdown last year, and Chuck Hagel's been sending signals that he can't take that size of a cut every year and maintain the kinds of lines you have. So I have been one that has been on record saying, I believe, given the fact that we swelled up so fast that we could shrink down faster. But I've spent a lot of time with these generals, Secretary of the Air Force right now, the acting Secretary of the Air Force and others, looking at the naval and Air Force dimensions to U.S. power, which seem to be the new platforms that we're using to have a more nimble way to deploy power in the world, that we're cutting into bone. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm just being seduced by some good persuasion, but I'm one who thinks that it needs to come down more incrementally because we got over-deployed in that area and stacked up. But I'm convinced right now that the last year cuts, which I saw Hagel go through, were costly, enormous, and he did it. I think he could do half of the budget cuts that we're facing him in the sequester this year, but they're going to get a little bit of relief. But I think in the long run, again, because I think that there's a bit of a shell game in how a superpower tries to sell itself as a big, powerful actor in the world, that once you go to war, you've begun to lose influence to the degree that powers see you growing or having capacity or moving the system without the kind of stresses we have today, the more that translates into an ability to influence others' actions. And so I do see the negative repercussions of the sequester, and the way we've been fighting over these cuts has diminished American power a lot. Yes, many, many people. Hi.
Hi. Just wondering, the overall Obama strategy and view of the world, is it that America is still number one, the most powerful, both militarily and economically, but doesn't that run counter then to the idea that we are shutting down the wars and that we're not going into Syria and that we want to spread the responsibility? So
It's a more humbled number one. It's a number one that is less number one than it used to be. It's a number one whose power is leveraged in the world in partnership with others. That, I hate the term leading from behind, but leading from behind makes a lot of sense because it brings other stakeholders into achieving outcomes. It empowers them, it affirms them, it tightens alliances. So whoever coined that, I think I know who it was, and was using it as a criticism of Obama. I think it's largely a strength. And we saw that in Mali, we saw it in Libya, we saw it in certain other areas, that the big global problems out there, it's not just military problems or the spread of terrorism, it's climate, it's all of these issues require collective action today, or they're just not going to move. And so to a certain degree, training ourselves to live in a place where we're a big player, but we're not definitive, is a really important aspect of us translating the kind of power we used to have into a continuing power down the road. So I think Obama has been very clear that he does see the United States as being an essential player, but he's also been very clear that we isolate ourselves and we make ourselves irrelevant to the world's future if we just try and do everything alone. And I would also add that one of the things that I think is misunderstood is that things like Syria, which are just horrible. I mean, Syria is, I don't know if any of you have been to Syria, it's a fascinating place, but it's been it's kind of a Balkan-like situation with lots of ethnic groups inside. I worry, Joe Biden spends a lot of time with Barzani of Kurdistan, and Kurdistan is very upset with how Maliki's been running Iraq and believes that he's violated their social contract, undermined the democratic norms they've committed to. And so Kurdistan's constantly flirting with going independent. If it goes independent, it grabs 3 million Kurds in Syria and a whole chunk of Kurds in Turkey, and you have a whole new conflagration on top of the mess you've already got. That could, I would put the chances of that happening about 30%, which are pretty high. And so when you look at those kinds of things and you say, could Nixon have done something? Could Ronald Reagan have done something like that? No, we would have meddled inside. We would have sent people involved now and then. We would have tried to engage, set up propaganda shell games during the Cold War. But nobody's going to go in and tamp down and completely shut down the kinds of civil war and sectarian strife on top of which a proxy conflict, unless you're all in, unless you want to. The fascinating thing I remind people, John Foster Dulles, after World War II, was really worried that Japan would slip